himself into now.
Wait, you're...
Hermes. Little insulted you didn't recognize me. My feelings might have even been hurt. I wasn't such a self-confident individual. I don't know if you noticed, but I'm killing you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to episode 9. So this is the last of the 5 main, most influential, and most frequently mentioned ancient Greek Olympians, the gods. Last week and the week before that, we went over the big 3, who of course are Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. And we call them the big 3 because they are the 3 sons of Cronus who were the leaders of the coup that dethroned him. Kind of ending the reign of terrible fathers, but I mean, these guys aren't the best dads either. They actually do pretty messed up stuff too. But either way, they were the last to overthrow anybody in order to take control of the universe, even though their realm was still pretty earthbound and not even including the earth. But anyways, that's what makes them the big 3, and they rule over, obviously, the sky, the sea, and the underworld. After those guys, we went over the goddesses of Mount Olympus. As a little refresher, they are Hera, Aphrodite, Athena, Artemis, Demeter, and Hestia. These gals fall into a little bit of a looser order of power. You can definitely still rank them, and that's why we put Hera at the beginning, being the queen of the gods, one of the original children of Cronus, and the wife that stuck to Zeus. She comes out on top for obvious reasons. And I know, I keep saying it, but Aphrodite was actually born before all of these other Olympians, depending on which storyline you follow. But even though she is kind of like a sister of Cronus himself, that doesn't really matter as they all became Olympians after the overthrow and then subsequent war that followed. And then of course, Athena carries weight as being the goddess of wisdom and battle strategy, and Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and finally, poor sweet Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, aka fire. But now that we know all of these guys, let's get into the boys. So a little bit like the ladies, with the exception of any kings or queen, the ranking order of the Olympian gods can kind of be whatever you want it to be. So the order we're going to go in is a little bit personal bias and a little bit from the popularity contest. So we'll start with the jock, Ares, then the musician, Apollo, the party god, Dionysus, the metal shop kid, Hephaestus, and then end everything off with the good old troublemaker, Hermes. So starting things off right out of the gate, let's get into Ares. He is, I guess, one of the many hotheads with a spot on Mount Olympus, but he is the one who's known to have a passion for his angry side. Ares is the god of war, battle lust, courage, and civil order, the peak of manliness. The Greeks sort of feared him, but he was a necessary evil in ancient times. With the threat of war constantly looming amidst land conquering, it was good to know that someone was there to help, sometimes. Ares is the more physical and brutal elements of war and battle, while his sister Athena, his counterpart, focuses on strategy and planning. When it comes to the god of war, there's usually 2 different ways he is depicted in ancient art. One is middle-aged, and one is more on the younger side. No matter the age group they put him in, he is of course always super ripped and super savage. The main difference between the ages is whether or not he sports a beard. But aside from his physical form, Ares is always shown with his main symbol, which is of course his helm or helmet, usually featuring a horsehair plume. His Romanized name, Mars, was then gifted to the little red planet that sits behind us. And get this, he is the only Olympian that is straight up 100% a child of Zeus and Hera. No games, no miracle fatherless births, just a 2-parent home for him. I think his relationship with Aphrodite really shows the intensity of both of their domains and also like the duality of war itself, which I mean, even though war is like horribly deadly, it is usually done out of necessity to protect your family, your city, or your country, right? And speaking of a war for good reason, during the Trojan War, Ares was interestingly on the fence for a lot of it. Originally, he was not going to take sides, but he ended up making a promise to his sister and mother to help out the Greeks. Then his GF Aphrodite asks him to, of course, help the Trojans because now she's all about Paris. So he says yes to her too. Then I guess this was working out for him for a little bit, but it all came crashing down when he was seen fighting on the battlefield with the Trojans. Pretty much the Greeks tried to withdraw because, what are they supposed to do now? But Zeus lets Athena go down there and push him from the battleground. And to do that, she uses a spear that was thrown by the Greek hero Diomedes and drives it through the chest of the god of war. This is obviously a huge shock to everybody there, but injured Ares just returned to Olympus to tend to his immortal wound. And once again, his soft side pokes its head out when he realizes that his son was actually killed in battle. He switches sides again and starts fighting for the Greeks. I think this was after they were supposed to not be involved at all anymore, but obviously that wasn't going to happen. So after Ares, we go on to Apollo. He is the god of prophecy and oracles, music, song and poetry, archery, healing, the plague and disease, and the protection of the young. But if you remember from last week, you see that plague and disease are also conveniently added into the middle of that long list of responsibilities. And some of that disease was given to the young boys that he was meant to look after. And him and his sister actually wiped out a whole family's generation off the map based on some uncalled bragging their mother did. But don't worry, he's actually not that bad of a god. The sun god is usually always depicted the exact same way: young, beardless, handsome. He's always carrying that lyre of his, and his other symbols are the laurel, that's the myth we're going to go over, a bow and arrows, like his twin sister, and the raven bird. So to do some straightening out here too, Helios is the Titan god of the sun, aka the personification of the sun itself. And Helios is the one with the flaming chariot who brings the sun in every morning. That's his whole thing. Apollo is the god of a bunch of other things and the sun. He is the only Olympian that gets to keep his Greek name after they were all borrowed by the Romans in their religion. But apparently the reason the sun god was kept the same was that he already had such a large cult following in the Roman Empire that there was no reason to make any alterations. His name was not gifted to any heavenly body either, just like his twin sister. But of course, it was given to the space program that eventually led to men touching down on the moon, which we still have some pretty fantastic photos from. The space mission was given the name Apollo after the former director of NASA's Glenn Research Center, Dr. Abe Silverstein, was at home flipping through his books and happened to come across an image of Apollo that was so inspiring, it was destined to be the right choice. His actual words about the choice were, Apollo riding his chariot across the sun was appropriate to the grand scale of the proposed program. NASA themselves go on to say that if the program had have been named Pegasus or something else along those lines, then even with a successful completion of the mission, the overall legacy might not have been concreted as a part of American history and culture as it is today. But naming things that are already in or are on their way to space after Greek mythology is a long-standing tradition in the astronomical world. You know, when I was a kid, I used to make believe that I was a demigod, and I used to think that I was the child of Apollo, and for the funniest reasons too. I liked being outside in the sun in the summer, but with Canadian seasons, what Canadian doesn't soak up every single little drop of sunshine, right? And my other reason was my whole family liked to keep the house extremely warm, all year round. Those two surface level indicators, I was yep, obviously we're all descendants of the sun god, didn't need to take into consideration anything else, not a single one of his other responsibilities or traits, that was it. But anyways, on to the laurel story. So the laurel leaves are what is usually thought to be the wreath worn by all of the Greeks and Roman gods and all of the higher ups too. But the laurel wreath among the gods is only worn by Apollo, and this is why. So what happened was there was this nymph, Daphne, who the sun god was completely in love with, and he pursued her daily, just obsessed. And I guess in this scenario, he's technically the weirdo here. But it sort of wasn't his fault. The two of them were actually victims of Eros, who hit them both with arrows. Her with one that made her despise all romantics, and him with one that overloaded him with lust. After his relentless hounding, she didn't have the energy to evade him anymore, so she sent out a cry to Gaia. And then, to help her out, what did she do? She turned the young nymph into a laurel tree. Didn't really help her out too much, because after watching the love of his life turn into a tree, well, he just said, okay, this is my official sacred tree, and now I'm going to wear her leaves forever. So, but anyways. So next up is Dionysus. He is the fun god, not a regular god. And he has control over some pretty wild stuff like wine, vegetation, pleasure, festivity, madness, and wild frenzy. Now, I don't know if you've noticed it, but there is a little bit of an emphasis on whether or not a deity has a beard or not, and usually having a beard ages them up. They are no longer described as a youth, but now as a man, usually a middle-aged man. Pretty much all of them are described as having one at one time or another. And beards are pretty natural for men to have, but the Greeks had shaving capabilities. The reason why the gods were all described as having beards was because a beard was meant to represent virility. They were only ever shaven off for mourning or if you were a coward and being shamed. Anyway, so Dionysus on the beard issue is also described as being two potentially different ages. One is as a middle-aged, mature man, of course, with a beard, and the second is as a slightly more effeminate man, sans beard. But beard or not, he could usually find himself in the company of some satyrs or wild women. Wild women do. He's often referred to as the twice-born god because, when his mother, the Princess Semele, was pregnant with him, Zeus's jealous wife, Hera, tricked him to appear before her in his godly form, which was way too much for a mortal to handle. So seeing him as a god, not in one of his disguises, killed her. But to preserve the life of his unborn child, he picked up the little baby and stitched him into his own thigh and carried little Dionysus to term. After the god was finally born, Zeus was done taking care of him for the most part, and it was time for him to be passed along to a couple of ladies that would nurse and care for him. The actual nurses could be a number of different characters. There are a bunch of variations as to what happens to the god after Zeus pops him out of his leg. The Romans actually have their own version of the story altogether, where Zeus, or Jupiter, actually didn't really help at all. Instead, Dionysus, the premature baby, and his dead mother end up in a chest somehow and float all the way to their shores. And BT dubs, his Roman name is Bacchus. But the most common nurses for the little baby god was Ino, Ago, and Autonoe, who ditched their own families for the opportunity to raise him up on the wild mountainside of Mount Kithaeron in Boeotia. But after he was all grown up, he apparently went on his merry little way, exploring the earth and becoming so interested in the vine of grapes that he eventually started juicing them, inventing wine. Unfortunately for him, though, Hera eventually found him, and like Athena, she was not happy to learn about his existence, so she struck him with madness, which led him wandering all over the place. Eventually, though, he did make it back to Greece, and then up to Olympus, obviously. Moving on, then there is Hephaestus. He is the lame god of fire, smiths, craftsmen, metalworking, stonemasonry, and sculpture. And just to say it again, the lame was meant to describe his physical ability, not his coolness. The story goes one of two ways. Either his mother, Hera, gave birth to the god out of 1000% rage after Zeus bore Athena from his head wound, and she was so disgusted by him, she tossed him off the mountain. The other version states that he was thrown from the mountain by Zeus after trying to stand up for his mother, and it took him an entire day to hit the ground. But either way, one of his parents tossed him off Olympus, and then he had to make his way back up to reclaim his spot. And the story goes on to say that once he got back up there, he crafted a golden throne for his mother, and she accepted it and took a seat in it, realizing she was unable to stand back up from it. He trapped her in there and left her there while the other Olympians pleaded with him to release his mother. And now, even from here, there are another 2 splits in the storyline. So after he was trapped, Ares and Dionysus got him drunk and brought him back up to Olympus to release her. And the other goes that he demanded to be married to Aphrodite in order to release her. But there are honestly so many more different versions of this one little story. But back to the god himself. So obviously he was injured and disabled in some way after falling off a mountain. And on top of that, he was also described as an ugly, dirty, bearded god, holding his smith tools and sometimes accompanied by a donkey. His Romanized name is Vulcan, so even though he didn't get a planet named after him in this solar system, of course his namesake planet is the fictional home of Spock and the rest of the Vulcans in the triple star system 40 Eridani, which is 16.5 light years from Earth, and apparently it is maybe possible that in that system there are Earth-like planets. But get this, so apparently in the early 20th century, there was a hypothesized planet between Mercury and the Sun, and that of course was named Vulcan as well. Being the planet would have definitely been its own little fireball. The naming totally makes sense, but now the question still remains, is there another planet there? So finally, we make it all the way to Hermes. You know what's crazy? When you look up Hermes still comes up first. And Google is like, oh, did you mean the Greek god? Sorry, here you go. Anyway, so Hermes is the god of boundaries, roads and travelers, thieves, athletes, shepherds, commerce, speed, cunning, wit, and sleep. And of course, he's also the divine messenger of the gods, specifically Zeus. Hermes is yet another god who has a bearded and beardless depiction. When he's beardless, he is young, handsome, and athletic. The bearded version is just an older, handsome, and athletic man, but with a beard. And of course, he can always be seen sporting his little winged shoes and holding his staff, the caduceus, which has the 2 intertwined snakes with some more wings on top. This symbol is now sometimes used by healthcare providers, even though it technically shouldn't be. It's more supposed to be like for commerce, but anyways. And his Roman name is Mercury, which of course he was lucky enough to be given to a planet and have that named after him. So Hermes apparently was some sort of troublemaker up on Olympus and also pretty much everywhere else, even when he was a little baby. So he is the son of Zeus and Maia, and he was born in a cave and raised by the nymph Selene. But her job was pretty easy because he grew so quickly. After only a couple of hours of being born, he was able to start walking around and wreaking havoc. First thing he did was kill a tortoise. And why, you may ask? Oh, well, to make a lyre, of course. With the dead tortoise, he took the shell and then added some horns and then stretched out a couple of strings of sheep guts across it and then taught himself how to play it. After those first couple of animal murders, he kept on wandering and finally made it to the pasture of the gods. The pasture was filled up with Apollo's herd of cattle. Hermes, being only like an hour old, was still able to think up sneaky ways to avoid being caught after stealing the god's herd. He walked those 50 cows out and all over the place, making sure to cover up their tracks so they couldn't be traced back to him. And after having to buy off a farmer so he wouldn't tattle, he sacrificed 2 of the cows and then made his way back to his mother's cave and slipped back into his baby clothes as if nothing had happened. But his mother, of course, knew what he did, and Apollo definitely had his suspicions. Hermes did eventually grow up himself and have a couple of children, and then he made a promise to never steal or lie again. And by doing this, he got his seat up on Mount Olympus too. And that's it. That's all 14 of the Olympian gods. But don't worry, all of these myths and more will be the topic of episodes to come, and we'll do a full, proper retelling, not these little speed throughs. So now, moving on to the fun part, this is the question contest to win the free Oh My Gods t-shirt, and this week's question is like a two-parter, two-answer type thing. So the question is, which god stole another god's herd of cattle? So the answer is going to be the two gods that are a part of this story. So if you know the answer, you can head over to ohmygods.ca/contest and submit your correct answers, and then add in your contact info and t-shirt size, and if you get picked, you can win a free t-shirt. Alrighty, well, that's the whole gang now. Well, the Olympic members. Even though I know it feels like we've been introducing so many deities the past 8 weeks pretty much. There are still so many more characters, monsters, minor gods, and creatures that fill up all the stories of Greek mythology, and they all have a reason or purpose for being there. But next week, we're actually going to be going over another book. Yay! Now, I have definitely mentioned this one a lot, but it's mostly just been in passing. But next week, we're going to go over it and go through all of the modern ways the myths were twisted to be funny and entertaining for kids. The book, of course, is Terry Deary's Twisted Tales of Greek Mythology. Now, the reading level is super low. I mean, I got this book when I was very young, but I still pick it up to read it in an afternoon or something because I still think it's a very entertaining little read. But anyways, that's what's on the docket for next week, so we'll talk about all of this stuff then. If you like what you heard, please feel free to follow, subscribe, rate, and all of the rest. And if you're looking for any info or deets, check out ohmygods.ca for the reading/watching list, as well as the cheat sheet and the upcoming episodes. Thanks again for listening. Okay, bye!